January 1984. Broken blood vessels mapped Trudy's cheeks and legs. She held a rosary in her hand and prayed that the UFOs would land and get her off the planet. She felt hairy, long-legged spiders crawling into her throat and lay helpless as they fought to get into the back of her throat. She began to gibber and scream, but no words came out of her lips. Lips were so dry they began to crack and bleed. Shrieks of agony were trapped inside her brain. God help me, she screamed. Suddenly she heard Stevie Wonder singing, "I Just Called to Say I Love You." Then somehow she managed to roll off the bed and crawl out to her car. She drove to a monastery several miles up the beach, a mad woman crazed with terror and wanting desperately to die. She drove through the fields behind the monastery at 50 miles per hour, tearing weeds and throwing chunks of earth. She drove straight for the cliff at 50 miles an hour. Suddenly, 3 feet from the edge, the car came to a soft, quiet stop. At 50 miles an hour, it came to a soft, quiet stop. A white light slowly depended upon the mad woman screaming, cursing. As she shrieked out her last scream against God and all of creation, the white light picked her up, engulfed her in its fog, and she floated into a melodic, peaceful sleep. And it lifted her, physically lifted her, and put her in the back seat of her car and covered her in a pink cloud. She would not come to until the next morning, any conscious awareness of what had happened. She didn't even remember. And then slowly the memory came to her, and she thought, oh, she was hallucinating. And yet she knew it had happened. Something not of this earth simply refused to let her die, particularly at this time. She still planned to kill herself. The car started. She kept it in park, went out to the edge of the cliff, and down below saw 3 children playing. And from there she had the vision come back to her, the one that Bob Temple in 1960, October of 1960, had told her of. That she had a disease she had to research, and she had to stay alive for the sake of the children of the future. She gave in. She got back in her car and drove back to her duplex. But she was completely enraged, out of her mind, insane. She moved a fridge across the room, back and forth, disconnected the stove. Then she smashed thousands of dollars in fine furniture and pitched them into a mutilated heap in the backyard. The whole neighborhood watched, stunned by what she was doing. Perhaps they should have stopped her, but she was wild with rage. Anyhow, even though she didn't remember what she had been through, they had heard her screams on the nights and the days that James Kelly raped and beat her. The brutality of the 5 months that he held her hostage. They knew all about the police refusing to help her, so they just watched in quiet horror. John returned Easter morning. He found Trudy lying paralyzed, catatonic, across what was left of the kitchen floor. He dragged her down into the basement bathroom. He dragged her kicking and screaming like the insane creature she had become. He stripped her naked. She hallucinated, thinking she was being raped again. John didn't bother to explain. He was a very large man and very strong. What do you say to somebody who's dying? The sight of her was sickening to him. She was 5 feet 7 inches in height and only weighed 90 pounds. Her skeletal frame was covered in sores and festering wounds. Green pus oozed from her belly button. Thick yellow muck splotched with bloody chunks that looked like raw meat splurted from her crotch. He held her under the cold shower and washed her down with Dove soap recommended by an allergist. Then he slicked her down in baby oil and wrapped her in cold, wet bath towels. She had to be cold. He knew that cold was the only thing that would bring down her pain. Fortunately for Trudy, John was a farm boy at heart, knowing basic survival techniques. Then he lay her down into the tub, calmer now. She'd stopped shrieking. The bed was soaked. He had no place he could put her, so he put some pillows into the tub, and she lay there, shivered, and tears streaming down her face. And John sat there, kneeling on his knees, hands over the tub, trying to calm her down, and he wept with her, while battling to keep her alive against her death wish. He telephoned the Mount Sinai Hospital where she had been treated and dumped off and on since 1966. This was now 1984. He begged them for help, but they all refused. What choices did he have left? Desperately, he force-fed her homemade broth laced with garlic and cayenne pepper. And he was a hunter, and he had some moose meat, and he put that into a broth for her, or was it beef? She doesn't know. But it was a broth, and he got it into her. It was an old recipe handed down from his grandmother. She choked it down as he wiped the drool from her mouth. He wept, cradling her in his arms, while she described the horrors of the visions she saw flying around the room. How could John tell her that what she saw were flashbacks and they were real? What she was describing were the rapes that James Kelly had done to her. Easter Monday, arriving from Sudbury with her father, her mother. Her mother begged her to go to AA. They thought it was her drinking. They didn't understand that it was her disease. She'd been sick since she was 6 years old. She was exhausted of fighting to survive in a world that was killing her. That night, John went to work only after he took a cab nearby AA meeting down the block, and he explained to the taxi driver to please carry her into the meeting. She doesn't remember much after that. Sometime later, she gave everything up. She sold what she had left, paid off the debts that she could, and moved into a shack in Wasaga Beach. A member in AA from Nova Scotia helped her, or was it Newfoundland? She can't remember. Father Tederman in Midland was her sponsor. He listened to her rage. She sat there trying to describe and do her fifth step and tell her story. A face twisted with rage and screaming, "Drink, bitch, or die." Bloodshot eyes that flare bulge, and he lunged across the room, grabbing her by the throat. He rams the beer bottle into her mouth. She can feel the breaking of her flesh against teeth as she chokes, chugging down the beer. It's another flashback. She screams to the priest, "Damn it, in AA, they say you're never forced to drink. But that's a lie, that's a lie. James forced me to drink. I can see him doing it. I know he did. Nobody will tell me the truth of what happened to me. But something terrible happened to me. And I know there were witnesses, and nobody would help me. And the police wouldn't listen to me." As a matter of fact, one cop even said to me, "There's nothing we can do about it because you cooperated with them," and threw me out of the police station. At another AA conference, she took another attack, screaming in shock and pain and crawling on the floor begging for help. That's the first time she met Tom Murphy. But she remembers it in pieces, distorted fragments of memory. He drove her back to Toronto for her last appointment with Father Tederman. Left her car parked at the cabin. She took a taxi to Midland. He convinced her she had to leave Toronto. She couldn't speak in whole sentences. "No, Sudbury, no, me home, no go, me, thank you, no." He wanted to bring her back to Sudbury with him. She couldn't explain to him. She was terrified of Sudbury. Sudbury had always been brutal to her, and she'd been warned by Bob Temple that Sudbury would try to kill her and to stay the hell out of there. But she couldn't explain any of that to him because it was all in dark regions of her brain. So he helped her into the cab. Now it was August 1984. Once more she felt faint as she attempted to leave the cab and climb the stairs at Midland. The blood drained from her once radiant, beautiful face. A look of death fixed in her eyes. She seemed like frozen granite, a body the weight of stone plummeted down the stairs. As cars spun past, a terrible dark surface moving towards her face. No, the words burst out. The grip that held her was all-consuming, her brain trapped in its vice grip. There would be no escape this time. Screams choked in her throat. The taste of gas was in her mouth. Diesel fumes permeated the air, filling her lungs to the bursting point. Her mind reeled and spun with tidal waves, dimming the horror and the fear. No, no, not again, she coughed, gasping. Poisonous hydrocarbons scorching her windpipe, feverish sweat streaming down her face. She could hear her own pulse pounding inside her brain, beating louder and louder, even as the leaves of agony came rolling in. She held her breath and tried to run, but to where? She couldn't run. She couldn't walk. She couldn't move. The wave returned, and down she went into the infinite dark chasm of time. Shit! The Jamaican cab driver screamed with fright as he tried to grab for her. Wham! With a thickening thud, she hit the cement stairs. Her body slumped, and she found herself staring up at the cross on the roof of the cathedral. Swimming waves of darkness reeled as she fought to stay conscious. You should be in hospital. He took her to a hospital. There was blood gushing down her legs. Don't know how long they were there. But a white woman doctor came to him and said, "She's not bleeding enough to die," and threw them both out. He took her home and took care of her for 3 days. Not long after that, he said, "I'm leaving Canada. If this is how Canadians treat poor sick women like you, I don't want to live here." Good Friday, 1984. Somehow she had survived. Yet it killed Trudy Upchan, the successful career woman. In every real sense, Trudy Upchan was dead. Only the crippling, retarded remnants of herself remained. Paralyzing attacks had mutilated her all her life. She sees again when, during that fateful summer of 1966, as another near-fatal attack strikes, her frail body went limp as it plummeted onto University Avenue. Blood and pus gushed from her crotch. The hospital had just released her without a diagnosis. They refused to sign her disability and come again. Trudy was just 25 and waging a war against prejudice, vying for a career in advertising. Blacks, pimps, hookers, people of the street from Toronto to New York were her rescuers. Countless times, Trudy Upchan could feel she was locked, trapped, frozen, imprisoned inside her brain. The horror is that the nightmares were real. They are her flashbacks. Before he left for home in Jamaica, he took her to a park, and he took her down to the waterfront. There was a little restaurant, and they used to have all-day breakfast. Baked beans and scrambled eggs with bacon. She'd been vegetarian since 1966, so she didn't eat the bacon. Or she tried to be vegetarian. Often she might break it. People would talk her into having steak, and then she'd get sick, and then she'd go back vegetarian for a while. But not that vegetarian ever cured her. It just stopped her from going into convulsions as bad as the meat did. It was a breezy, sunny day in unusual dry heat for August in downtown Toronto. Clustered ants on the shores of our Great Lake, Ontario. Toronto normally tended to be extremely humid. Trudy had begun slowly in painful agony. To try to get herself dressed, but he called, the Jamaican, and he came and he helped her get dressed. And he took her to the restaurant. And she ate what she could, and then he took her to the park, and they walked. They walked the beach. Seemed like hours. I mean, mainly she wasn't walking, he was holding her up. But he felt that if she moved, it would be better for her. And that was the last time she saw him. She was leaving Toronto. Everything was at the cabin, a little shack in Wasaga Beach. Her mother had called long distance and said, Don't drive if you're feeling sick. And she said, Mother, if I don't drive when I'm feeling sick, I'd never drive again. I don't drive when my legs are crippled because I can't move. But otherwise, I'm okay to drive. Just because I can't walk doesn't mean I can't drive. And she left. All the way to the cabin in Wasaga Beach, she sobbed, her brain flashing, moaning, stuttering, to the images of a child of 6 screaming in pain. Approximately 1947, the first hideous attack had struck her down in her parents' driveway while skipping rope. Despite gruesome handicaps, by 12 years of age, she ran out of books to read. She had covered all there was to be found in a library, finding very little medical knowledge that was useful. She had free government health care, but it hadn't done her much good. She's talking to herself, and she said, What good are my taxes? I paid my taxes. I never cheated, and I never lied, and never stole. What, the cabbie says? Oh, she wasn't driving. She'd left her car in Wasaga. She was in a taxi. Nothing important, thanks, she replies. Nothing important.